Deserts are one of the most misunderstood biomes when it comes to world building. Most of the time, they just end up like a endless yellow blob on maps, sandy, empty, full of cliches like genies or nomads, or giant scorpions or giant worms. But I'm here to tell you from experience that even though it seems like nothing is out in the desert, they're diverse, harsh, beautiful, and full of clever adaptations. And today, I'm going to go as deep as I can on why deserts form, including those weird ones right next to the ocean, where to place them realistically, how life survives, what unique cultures and economies emerge, and how to make it feel more alive and more fresh, despite it feeling like there's nothing out there. Hopefully by the end of this video, you're going to have something that feels believable and inspired, so let's get into it. Deserts are not just hot and dry. There are places where it like barely rains, so it's usually like less than 10 inches of rain a year. That's almost nothing. So think of it like getting one heavy storm every few months and then absolutely nothing else for the rest of the year. So why is it so dry? So mountains kind of block rain. So when wet air hits a mountain, it dumps all of it on one side, the rainy side, and then blows dry air over the other side. And that casts a rain shadow, and it's super common. And the closer you get to the equator, either 3 degrees north or south, depending on your world, you can choose to do whatever you want with this. So just make sure that it's consistent. But the air sinks down from high up, and when air sinks, it dries out and makes it stop raining. That's where like these big dry zones come from, and where a lot of the most famous deserts sit. Like think the Australian outback, the Sahara, and the Mojave. There's also continental deserts. Like air picks up moisture over the ocean, soaking it like a sponge, and as it travels, every time it hits something in its path, the sponge gets squeezed a little bit. And by the time it reaches the middle of a continent, it's bone dry. So if you're using this to create like a sprawling empire, the deeper your characters travel to the heart of a continent, the more expensive water becomes because like Ocean's Gift or whatever can't reach them. That's why almost all big cities are on the coast. There's the rare coastal deserts. So you'd think that being next to the ocean means rain, but cold currents kind of put a lid on it. So cold water kind of chills the air above it, making that air heavy and lazy. So it turns into a fog that's not enough to really make real rain clouds. This is kind of like a glass ceiling. The moisture is right there, but it can't get up into the sky. The thing is that even though they live on a coastline, people might constantly feel damp or surrounded by fog, but they'd still be dying of thirst because it never actually rains there. I also wanted to mention polar deserts. Try to think of air temperature like a storage container for water. Hot air is kind of like a gigantic warehouse, and cold air is like a tiny locker. Because when most people think of Antarctica, they think of like a giant block of water, but it's actually kind of like a frozen vault. So the air there is so cold that it physically cannot hold moisture. It's essentially starving itself for water vapor. And even though you'd be standing on miles of ice, that ice is kind of locked away. There's no new rain or snow falls because the air is so cold that it can't even make a storm in the first place. This might be a little bit scientific, but cold air is kind of dense and it sinks. Sinking air doesn't form clouds. It just kind of pushes them away. And that's why polar deserts often have like the clearest blue skies on the planet, despite being the coldest areas in the world, you know? When you think about it, it's almost like a double-edged sword. So to live out there, you would need to melt ice for hydration, right? But that would also take precious fuel and heat, which is even scarcer than the water. So as a summary, the continental desert is like not finding any water at all. You're thousands of miles away from the nearest well. And for coastal deserts, it's being surrounded by water that you can't use. You're soaking wet from fog, but you're still dying of thirst. And for polar deserts, it's dehydration in a world made of ice, but you can't use any of it without trying to use other resources. So where do we put these things on a map? Because you can't just slap them anywhere. And it feels fake if it's next to a jungle or something with no explanation. And we're not even going to talk about just making up biomes and putting them next to each other with no magic or no nothing. Because let me tell you, There is nothing worse than making a biome set world with 4 biomes or something like that, and there's no reason or rhyme as to why it is like that. I'm going to give you some simple rules that you can follow. You can probably tweak them for your world, but let's go. In general, hot deserts usually are like 10 to 35 degrees from the equator, like 20-30 on both sides. Cold deserts are further out, like 35 to 75 degrees in the middle of big land masses or like behind mountains or something like that. And coastal deserts might be next to the ocean, but they're super dry. So put them on the west side of a continent with like maybe cold ocean nearby. If you want an example of like real life ones, you can look at the Atacama next to the Pacific Ocean, or the, oh my goodness, Namib Desert next to the Atlantic, and parts of the Baja California. Also, please, for the love of God, do not do transitions where it's just like forest to dunes, or I'll come to your house. If you want to know how to do it, it goes from grassy drylands to rocky hills to full sand, and that's how you get the sand dunes and then the desert. So what does walking around on this stuff feel like? So there's reg, which kind of feels a little bit like walking on pavement, and it's also kind of loose and crunchy. It's called reg, and that's kind of how it feels like you're just walking on a giant tray of kitty litter, and it's exhausting because there's a little bit of give still. I found this specifically when I was in the Mojave in the Joshua Tree National Park. There's playas. So these were on ancient lake beds, and the ground just dries up into these huge like lake squares. They look like they're rock solid, but like when you step down on them, it gives a little bit. It's kind of like a sun-baked shell over doughy, damp clay. That's part of the reason why when you go to Death Valley National Park, East Track Playa has those sailing stones that move around by themselves. If it's wet out there, or if it's having some kind of sensitive weather pattern or something, they won't actually allow people to go there because their footprints will be left behind, because when you step in, there's just a little give, and if it's too wet out there, it'll permanently damage the area. While I have never been to Antarctica, I've seen enough videos of people who've been there or worked there that I can describe it for you. So the snow isn't wet, it's kind of like dry powder, ice crystals, and when you walk, it doesn't crunch. It kind of squeaks and screeches. It kind of sounds like rubbing 2 blocks of styrofoam together. And if you push them together, they kind of just, if you took 2 pieces of Cheetos and then you shove them together and they turn into that dust, it's kind of like that. I know that the one that you guys are the most familiar with is kind of the mix of sand area. So it's usually where dunes meet stone. So if you look at Joshua Tree, it's very similar to that. There's sand dunes all around Joshua Tree. So obviously the land around it is going to be heavy with sand. So it'll be like a mix of walking on a hilly beach, kind of. So it can be really frustrating. And the last one is the ones that you guys already know. So there is the flat desert ones that is so dry that it's kind of like walking on regular cement. That's what I would say. It's like walking on regular cement. There's no give, there's no softness. It's just all hard all together. These are from like ancient lake beds. I did want to talk a little bit because deserts do change over time. So the Sahara was green and full of lakes about 6,000 years ago. And in your world, you could probably have some buried cities or petrified forests underneath the sand. So feel free to make up historical things happening in your timeline. Let's talk a little bit about the life of the desert and how things adapt out there. Because a lot of people assume that the deserts are dead, and they're not dead, they're just different. In general, a lot of the plants out there like to store water in their body like sponges. Think like cacti and succulents and stuff like that. They have thick, tiny leaves and lose less water, or they grow super deep roots, and some can handle super salty soil. And when it comes to animals, a lot of them hide during the day where they either burrow or sleep, and they come out at night. Big ears dump heat. Light fur reflects the sun. Some of them can store water in their bodies that are extra. Think of like a camel. And a lot of predators tend to use venom so they don't have to waste energy chasing. And I'm not saying that you can't have something that's different, but I'm just saying, make it so that it can live in the ecosystem that you created. If there is like a horse, perhaps, just an example, not like a mule, but a horse, and it has it's pretty big and it lives out there. So maybe what you do is maybe it's able to hold water in its body for longer periods of time, maybe like a month or something like that. It should have something, or maybe it has different types of hooves where it can search for water, or maybe that it can smell water. You have to add something, or maybe it's magic. I don't know. I'm just going to say, try to avoid the same old thing like scorpions and sandworms. Try different stuff. Try insects or birds of prey or burrowing monsters or just anything. Just anything. Remember, there are little pockets of life in the desert. There's underground rivers, there's springs, there's fog zones that create like oases, and that's great for like hidden villages or sacred spots. I want to point out one thing about oases. So for oases, the reason that they have water to begin with is because they have like an aquifer. And sometimes they're replenished from water coming from a distant, higher altitudes from somewhere around, through rocky layers and stuff like that. They are usually found in a lower elevation area where the water table is high enough that it can just reach the surface. If you decide that you're going to make something that's as big as a predator, you're going to need to decide what does it eat, who eats it, and how does it not waste energy because of the heat. Because if your creatures feel real, the area feels real. How do people live and survive out there? Whatever you want, water rules everything in the desert, and without a good answer for where's the water, your whole setup is going to kind of feel like bullshit. There's underground channels that bring water down from the mountains. These are still in use today. There's huge stone tanks that store water for months. There's also foggy coasts where people hang nets on hills to catch the morning mist and turns that fog into drinking water. That is a real thing if you guys want to check it out. It's done in the Atacama Desert, and people dig really deep for hidden aquifers or use plants that pull water from the air. In my own world, I have like a magic thing that happened where an area in the desert of Addicts is flourishing because they kidnapped a person and made them kind of into a beast so they can just bring water to that location by using the person, like kind of making them a sacrifice. Don't be afraid to have a city that has an underground river or an ancient lake. Nomads that know about hidden springs only to their tribe. You could maybe do something with magic where they condense dew or pull moisture from rocks or something like that. You could also create some kind of symbiotic relationship between beast and people, and they work together so that they can get water based on like a coastal town type thing. Either way, you're going to need to show your water sources early. You can't just have a huge army walk in and suddenly there's enough water for everyone. That is just not going to happen. I know this is using the opposite, but this was kind of a thing in World War I. There was the Winter War, which was Finland versus the Soviet Union, and the Finns were wearing white camouflage and accustomed to sub-zero temperatures. So they just basically waited out the Soviets because, well, they're not used to the cold, so they just basically waited them out. It would be the same thing, but for deserts. Now we got to talk about like cultures and societies and how to not make them cliche, because every time, I swear to God, I see a desert culture, it feels super duper generic to me. You guys just need to think about how the desert shapes how people live and trade and believe, and don't make them all the same. Sure, there can be a little bit of farming. There can be, other than salt, there can be like coppers and gems, coastal fish, rare plants. There's also caravans that follow oasis. It's dangerous, but it's rich. In my world, I have a type of precious stone that is only used and can be cultivated through the desert. And only the people of the desert in this one guild know how to make it into a powder. So it's just a way to create trade. I want to point out also that nomads tend to move with animals, raid, or protect routes. They share stories between themselves orally, but there's no big libraries, I don't think. Over on Reddit, there's a huge complaint about stereotypes. So please try to skip the robes plus tents plus evil sultan. Maybe take a little bit of a taste of what's over there. Check to see what kind of people live in the deserts there. See how they survive. Don't be afraid to mix them with something else. For example, in my desert land area, attics, I kind of mix multiple things together. I don't want to say what I mix together, but I mix a lot of different types of cultures together that are usually in deserts. And one that's, and I mix a little bits of stuff from a video game that I really liked in there because it made sense for me. God, if you're going to take something from a culture and you're going to use it, make sure you actually understand what that thing is and how it's used before you apply it to your world so you don't accidentally do some cultural appropriation bullshit. You don't want that on your plate. And I'm going to suggest this book again, if only because I feel that everyone who wants to have a desert culture should read it to get ideas and maybe understand how not to do cultural appropriation, because this book is so amazing. I need everyone to go read The City of Brass and all the rest of the books because they're so freaking good. You just really, 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 really need to read it, okay? Read it. I feel like a lot of people are afraid to play with deserts because they're dangerous and they're hot and they're hard and it makes them scary to try to ride in. But let me help you with that. Have your characters move at night, or if there's an emergency, they can move during the day. Have somebody get severe sunburn and then have them have to have like a little side quest so the character can actually get better. Try to have somebody, give the characters maybe some advice on a path to take, or have them do something to where they have to do a favor so they can get that information. Are sandstorms in the desert, so it's zero visibility, sand is everywhere. Maybe your characters are going to have to tie stuff around their faces and huddle together. And yes, you can get lost, and mirages can trick you into thinking that there's stuff ahead of you like water. When it comes to stuff like armies, they will probably run out of water before they run out of fight. Whoever controls the water is basically who is going to win. As an example, you can actually have climate change be one of the factors that a new coastal town emergence place has a green explosion, festivals, or wars because of this. Buried old cities from wetter times, explorations to find treasures or maps or whatever. We haven't even figured out that one cave that has all those soldiers in it that's from China, I believe. We still haven't figured all that out. So that's just like buried treasure in real life. You could maybe make the desert the bad guy, where it's like forcing the heroes to make tough choices, like save water or save a friend kind of situation. I wanted to have a little bit of a section for questions that I found that didn't have direct answers, but stuff maybe people wanted to know. I've seen this one a little bit, and it's, can a whole planet be a desert? And yes-ish. If the water is super rare, like tiny pools or aquifers, life clings to the foggy coasts, so people would not be wanting to live out in the middle of nowhere. If you want to see how people kind of live in that kind of thing, I would suggest maybe watching Trigun or the new one, the Vash Stampede one. Some other common ones that I've seen where how can you make a desert next to a jungle? You need a transition, which is a steppe, badlands, dunes, or a rain shadow explanation. What if both sides of the mountain is dry? It's possible with cold currents on one side and super dry on the other. So think like a mountainscape on the side of like the Pacific Ocean. So that's kind of what you would get there. All this thing about endless dunes survival, well, that would be tough because people need shade cycles and rock islands for rest and stuff like that. So you're probably going to have to do a little bit of work to figure that out. Resources beyond salt would be like minerals, guano, offshore fish, rare fog plants, things like that but it could be precious stones from one location. You're also trying to run the ocean-turned desert. Flash floods form temporarily pools, and buried seabeds become aquifers. I implore you to start very easy by placing deserts where there's dry air, mountains that make sense. Explain how people get water, and then add unique quirks afterwards. Here are some tough questions that I found on the internet. I wanted to maybe offer some answers if you are one of those people. How realistic is a near total desert planet or continent with civilizations, especially oasis-only or aquifer-dependent ones? It's tough, but doable if you're careful. Try to think Mars after it dried out, but with pockets that stayed wet longer. Real science says that full desert worlds struggle to keep stable climates or widespread life because water evaporates away fast without oceans to buffer things out. But underground, fog coasts or polar melt can create survivable spots. Civilizations, I believe, would be small, kind of clustered around those reliable sources. Oasis cities, underground networks, fog harvesting towns. But I want to make you understand that this planet is not going to be teeming with life everywhere. But it did have to be stable enough at some points to have life on it. So kind of think of the rainforest. The rainforest is where all of life comes from in general. So it had to be green and it had to be stable long enough to have life flourish. And then life adapted to this way of life now. Another question is, how can deserts have biodiversity anomalies or weird features without feeling random or magic only? The key is to ground them in real ecological, geological, or climate processes, because real deserts are full of surprising and patchy life. Because keep in mind that deserts aren't uniform voids. They're kind of patchy, I guess. You could have something like a microhabitat, which is a tiny niche, like oasis, rocky outcrops, or salt flats. I want to look at some weird anomalies. I want you to look at the fairy circles from the Namib, I don't even know how to say it, desert. There's also the fog oases from the Atacama Desert. There's also a little bit of singing/booming dunes because of the wind or a bunch of sand avalanches.
Listen to that. The dunes are singing. Wow.
I do not want to answer this. I'm going to answer it. It's how to place deserts next to impossible biomes, rainforests, or glaciers without breaking climate logic. It is a little bit realistic and it does happen on Earth, but it usually requires sharp transitions and specific drivers like tall mountains or rain shadows or cold currents, like coastal dryness or some kind of other thing. Sharp boundaries exist, but they're rare, and in most cases have gradually faded out. An example, there is a desert right next to a rainforest. It's in the Atacama Desert, is right across from the Amazonia rainforest. The Bolivia-Brazil side. Here's another one where it says, what happens to buried/ancient settlements or ecosystems when climate flips from wet to desert over time? Well, the answer to that is that they just get buried by sand. They're often preserved remarkably well due to dryness, and they often have anomalies like petrified forests or fossil rivers, salt-encrusted ruins, mummified remains. If you want, look at the Sahara like 15,000 years ago when it was still like a savanna with lakes and rivers. And there is, how do massive desert trade empires or coastal hubs thrive without modern tech, like logistics, water for caravans, seasonal routes? Well, the thing is that they relied on camels. They can carry a lot of weight and they can go days without water. Then there's, people finding oasis/hidden wells. There's also seasonal timing, traveling at night. There's infrastructure with tribal and state. And there would be obviously a water monopoly somewhere. I mean, you have to think about it. Caravans were huge back then, like 1,000 to 2,000 camels, and they would move slowly, like 20 to 30 miles a day. Saw this one, which was extreme adaptations for cold/arid polar deserts or low gravity weirdness. So polar deserts like Antarctica's McMurdo dry valleys or the Arctic islands are real. They really don't get any kind of precipitation. But the thing is the life is microbial and extreme, with stuff adapting for freeze, drying, antifreeze, proteins, dormancy, and wind resistance. No large animals live on these things. I mean, if you're wanting to add something that's like a civilization, you're going to have to probably do some kind of work. Maybe do a little bit of a study on how people live in Antarctica and then maybe try to reverse engineer how you would do that if people live there full time, but like 1,000 years ago. So that's everything. I'm going to do a real quick recap on the do's and don'ts so that you guys can remember it. Start with water logic first, always explain the sources. Add transitions and patches, semi-arid buffers, rocky badlands, oasis hot spots, microbiomes, fog strips, salt flats, like that. Diversify your cultures / mix inspirations. Try to subvert tropes if you can. Use climate history, ancient wet areas for buried ruins, petrified forest, fossil rivers as plot hooks, okay? Make anomalies feel earned, tie them to real processes. As an example, wind erosion for singing dunes, termites for fairy circles, blah, 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 blah. Here are some don'ts. Don't plop the desert randomly, it has to make sense. Don't make it all endless dunes, mix rock, salt, gravel, badlands for variety. Don't ignore scale. Vast emptiness should feel dangerous. Do not recycle cliches, for God's sakes. Please skip Arabian Nights unless it can't be subverted. Don't overcrowd with biodiversity. Keep it scarce and efficient, but highlight niches like fog beetles or venom hunters or whatever. Add something new and different. Sources are in the desert. Salt, minerals, gems, rare plants, animals, offshore, coastal fish, fossils, and artifacts. When it comes to the polar stuff, they're going to be located in high latitude, plus rain shadows, plus cold air, holding a little bit of moisture. It's freezing constantly, wind sculpted rocks, permafrost, sparse life. If you're going to have a civilization there, underground or insulated sediments, full and wool economies, myths about eternal cold and dark kind of thing. If you want to add an adaptation that these people have, maybe antifreeze proteins, dormancy, cryptobiote stuff, thick insulation, think of all that stuff. So I can't think of anything else, but that's it for this deep dive. I hope I gave you guys some tips and tricks to help you make your desert feel more alive. And hopefully you can build a wasteland that's not just empty stand, but maybe full of stories instead. Thank you guys for watching, and if this video inspires you the way that it inspires me, please feel free to go over to my Patreon where I write my stories, show my full res art, and all that stuff, and you can see my personal world building. If you have any questions that I haven't answered, please feel free to drop it in a comment below. And if I've inspired you with something, let me know in the comments too. I would love to hear if this had inspired somebody to do something interesting. If you enjoyed this, please hit that like button and subscribe because it really helps the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one of these. I know I do a mix of my art and the world building, so please love both. I would love you if you love both. And if you guys want a different video for next time, like jungles or mountains or whatever, feel free to leave a comment below telling me what you would like to hear next. Maybe I'm thinking about doing rainforests. I don't know. But if you want to know how water works, I have a video for you right here on the screen. So feel free to go check that out. Bye.